Okay, so we ended up talking about some of the anatomy of the external, middle, and internal ear last class. Any questions on that so far? Nothing? What am I doing? So all of these apparatus are accessory structures to the receptors for two senses in that inner ear. What are the two things we're going to find receptors for in that inner ear? Just yell it out. Balance, equilibrium, and hearing. So we have two sets of canals, and through these canals run fluid. That fluid is going to be important in firing off the receptors for these senses. At the top part of the diagram, over here in this region, we find canals that are going to help with our sense of equilibrium, along with receptors that we find in this region. Those are called the semicircular canals. Over in this region here, we find this little snail shell called the cochlea. And what are we going to find in there? More canals with fluid and the receptors for our sense of hearing. We're going to find those located in an area called the organ of Corti. And we're going to find our receptors for equilibrium in an area called the macular region. So, what we're going to find here is a series of canals formed by membranous and bony labyrinths. And the fluid that flows through them is called perilymph and endolymph. So when I talk about the bony canals that are created inside this structure, they're filled with perilymph. When I talk about the membranous canals in these structures, they're filled with endolymph. And the entrance to both of these structures is in this region here called the vestibule. Now, we already talked about three little bones, the incus, the malleus, and the stapes, that were moved by what? Sound waves, right? That came in and got funneled down through the outer ear, down what? Well, it's down a canal. Yep, the external what? Acoustic meatus. And those sound waves are going to bang into that drum head we talked about, called the tympanic membrane. That's going to set those bones in motion, and they're going to push against something called the oval window once that vibration gets down through the bones and reaches the stapes. Yeah, that's the stirrup. It looks if you ever rode a, yeah, you're with me, right? Horse. It's Monday, I haven't had coffee. No, it's Tuesday and I haven't had coffee. Yeah. So that's going to push on this area called the oval window, and that's going to set up waves. Waves in this region. Waves in that fluid that flow through the cochlea. Also, what we find in the vestibule region is an area that's going to be responsible for transmitting waves when I move my head in different directions through the semicircular canals. What's a vestibule? It's like an entrance to a fancy building. You know, some of them have fountains and a little receptionist. Well, your vestibule to your inner ear is the entrance to those canals and all of that fluid. So the semicircular canals in an area called the ampulla is what we're going to bump into first with respect to equilibrium. The cochlea, again, is going to have waves set up by that oval window. And if we look at the middle ear, there's another window down here. It doesn't have any bones associated with it, but it's called the round window. And between the two windows, they're going to help absorb some of the waves that are created when the stapes pushes against the oval window. So, once I set up those waves inside the cochlea, those waves are going to flow through those canals we just mentioned, created by the membranous and the bony labyrinth in the perilymph and the endolymph. And as those waves pass by these structures, and this is what you're going to look at in lab this week, when you look under the microscope, when you look at the cochlea under the microscope, actually I think you looked at it, did you look at it last week? No, you're going to look at it this week. You're going to see this under lower power. What you're going to hone in on is this. So you have to put your microscope up to a higher magnification so you can see inside those canals. And this is what hopefully you'll see, very close to what you'll see. This structure here in the center is called the organ of Corti. And contained inside there is very similar setup to what we've already talked about when we talked about sight, when we talked about taste, when we talked about smell. We talked about supporting cells, epithelial cells, that sandwiched in the receptors for all of those senses we've already talked about. In this case, the receptors are for your sense of hearing, and they're going to send message for processing in the cerebral cortex down what cranial nerve? 8. The what? What's the name of cranial nerve 8? The vestibulocochlear. See where it got its name? So guess where the other branch of that cranial nerve is? In the vestibule region. It's going to send message for your sense of equilibrium. So this is where we're going to send message for processing in the cerebral cortex down the vestibular cochlear cranial nerve 8. So let's have a closer look at the cells that we're going to find there. Again, just like all of the other senses we spoke about in this chapter, those sensory receptors are going to be sandwiched in cells that are holding and supporting them still. In this case, those dendrites we talked about when we talked about taste buds and our gustatory response, when we talked about our sense of smell and olfaction, those little hair-like extensions are what part of this cell? It's silly, but if I want to start sending a message down any sort of neuron or sensory receptor, I have to start the message flowing at the dendrites. So when we look at this cell, did I say it already? Okay, I repeat myself. Again, the coffee. Give me a break. So, hairs or stereocilia for our sense of hearing can be found on those receptor cells. This little guy up here is also going to be part of the response. It's going to help the mechanical response travel down these neurons. Because what kind of sense is your sense of hearing? What kind of receptor? They're mechanoreceptors. So there has to be some sort of physical movement to fire off these guys. So again, I can't shine a light in my ear and hear better. Yes? I can't put perfume in my ear and hear better. It's not that kind of receptor. So what's going to set up that mechanical movement, you think? Those vibrations are the beginning, right? The vibrations are going to cause the bones to go into motion. The bones in motion are going to cause the fluid to go into motion. And the fluid is going to flow through this. This is going to move across those stereocilia in different patterns and fire off different numbers of those sensory receptors for our sense of hearing. Make sense? So fluid, let's go back and take a look at our cochlea. Remember the cochlea? Fluid's flowing this way through these canals in different patterns depending on how many waves get set up. Remember the big picture? Oh, wait a minute. We're going back? Yes? So I push on the stapes, I set up fluid waves within those, going in the wrong direction, within those canals. That fluid's going to flow by the organ of Corti. As it flows by, it's going to move that tectorial membrane, and that is the mechanical stimulus to fire off our receptors.
Where is the fluid actually moving?
This way. That's why I went through the pictures.
Like, is it over the
It's flowing this way. Huh? Go look at the picture. Yep. But think about the canals. They're moving through this way. That's going to cause things to move. Yes? Okay. Closer look. We see our stereocilia, that outer hair cilia poking up through the canals, and the tectorial membrane having the ability to rub against them to cause sensory information to be sent for processing in the cerebral cortex. So, in your textbook, on page 575, under the physiology of hearing, they talk a little bit about some of the properties of sound waves. You did a little experimenting with this last week when you used these little pitchforks that had higher and lower tone. So as those waves move through the air, depending on their amplitude, the height of the wave, or the distance, we get different patterns of waves that are created in the semicircular, in the cochlea with respect to hearing. So we're actually physically moving molecules through the air. So high frequencies give us waves that are what? High pitch. But what do the waves look like? They're really tall and they're short. As opposed to, oh, yes? And what do my waves look like in a low frequency? They're going to have a wider distance underneath the wave. The other thing, loud, soft. Yes? What's going to happen to the height? The pressure. If I have a soft sound, I'm not going to create as much pressure. I'm not going to create as much of a wave. When I have a soft sound, do I fire off more or less receptors? Less receptors, less wave. So the combination of the two gives us all of the different combinations we hear through sounds in the environment. Is it difficult to hear when I can't create those pressure waves and funnel them down to the middle ear? Yeah. If I put a wall in my way, I can scream on one side, but if those sound waves don't move the air enough to create these pressure differences, am I going to be able to hear anything? You ever try to hear underwater? My kids love to do that. Go, put your head underwater and scream. Let me see if I can hear what you're saying. It sounds different, doesn't it? Why? Yeah, because the sound traveling through water is going to change this graph. So anything that disrupts the wave creation, say you have a problem with your tympanic membrane, say you have a problem with your auditory ossicles, are you going to be able to hear properly? So those are one thing that might cause a problem. The other thing that creates pressure changes is the vibration you make when you speak. That's why you don't sound anything like you think you sound. You ever hear yourself on a tape recording and go, that's me? That's weird. Because I sound very different to me than to you. Because not only am I creating message from the air that I move with my voice, But I also have vibrations in my head that are firing off receptors as well. Okay, so those are some of the different things that you actually tested in lab with respect to hearing. Now, this is the pathway that you should understand when we talk about sound waves and their pathway to our sense of hearing. You can find this diagram on page 577, and you know me and my numbered diagrams, how I love them so. If you don't, let me give you just a little hint. Your exams are always going to be a combination of multiple choice and essay. And I love things in order. So this might be what? A possible essay question on your next exam. So the pathway of sound waves, and we've pretty much covered most of them, yes, can be seen in this diagram. Vibrate that tympanic membrane, move those auditory ossicles, creates pressure waves within the cochlea, and then that's going to travel through a helicotrema. And do not excite hair cells. But sounds in the hearing range go through the cochlear duct, and they vibrate that membrane, and they cause deflection in the hair cells, and we can hear them. So we don't hear all sound, do we? Some are way too high or way too low pitch for us to hear. Ever get one of those dog whistles and freak your dog out? How come? They can hear it. You can't because they have what? They have receptors that can hear in that range. They have receptors that fire off in that range. Just like when we talked about visible light. There's so much more light in our environment than what we can see. But we only have receptors that'll go between that 400 and 700 range in the spectrum of light. Same with other animals in their sense of hearing and hearing receptors. So know that. So some of the different things that can mess up our hearing are how long things resonate or move the air. We can hear things for longer or lower periods of time. And that frequency, how fast, how much wave is going to be created and displacement is going to be created to allow us to hear things. So who's responsible for sending messages in the auditory pathway? And this is on page 579 in your textbook. Well, we know that cranial nerve 8 is responsible for helping me get the message to the spinal cord and then to the cerebral cortex, eventually through the medulla and the midbrain. And then processing is going to happen where? Where do you hear? What part of your brain? In the temporal lobe. So in the cortex of the temporal lobe, we are going to process that information. In the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, we're going to get the information there. So everything leading up to that is the pathway in which this information will take for processing in the cerebral cortex. Yes? Good. The other group of receptors hooked up to my lovely little vestibulocochlear cranial nerve 8 is these guys. And we find these in the macula of the utricle and the macula of the saccule. In the vestibular region at the base of the semicircular canals. Whew. Same setup. We've talked about this whole chapter. What we're going to find there is little regions where receptors are located for our sense of equilibrium. And how are we going to set up the sound waves? Is it sound waves that we set up for equilibrium? Yeah, movement of my head in different directions are going to help set up the waves in the semicircular canals. The reason we have going in three different directions is because you can go in three different directions. Yes? Up, down, side to side. That's one. So this is what we're going to see the setup looking like in the regions where we find receptors for equilibrium. So again, we have the supporting cells, just like all the other guys. Then we have the receptors, and what are the receptors called? Hair cells. They have cilia. Guess what the cilia is called? Stereocilia, same as we had in the cochlear region. We also call it stereocilia. But it's a little bit different. When we talk about equilibrium, we're not going to have a tectorial membrane that rubs across the top. What we have is stereocilia that's kind of embedded in its membrane. The membrane is called the otolithic membrane. And there's actually little rocks in there. That's what an otolith is. So otoliths embedded in the otolithic membrane, so you do have rocks in your head, are going to help with your sense of equilibrium. So those little stereocilia form bundles that are embedded in the membrane above it. So when you set up waves, the same thing's going to happen. Fluid's going to move through this area, and the membrane is going to move and fire off the hair cells. Again, that information is going to be sent to the cerebral cortex for processing for our sense of equilibrium. So different things like rotation and movement through space are going to cause waves to happen in this region.
The hair cells, do they adapt to?
Yeah.
Because, like, for instance, like a fighter jet pilot, they have to go through tests for a long period
Correct.
of time.
And some people are, by different movements through space, some people are actually, what's the word I want? Anybody get car sick? Yeah, motion sick. Okay, some of that can actually disrupt other things in our bodies. So you have to kind of train yourself, like you say, to some of this movement. They give you an example of a skater spinning around. Do you ever go to a party and spin around? And then try to, you've done this. If you haven't done it, you've seen a YouTube video of it, or Funniest Home Videos. Everyone's seen it, everybody knows what I'm talking about. You sit around, you get a little bat, and you spin around in circles, and then you try to get up and walk, and everybody always, smashes into something and makes a total fool of themselves. Well, why doesn't that happen to the figure skater when they spin around really fast on the ice? Well, and did it happen the first time this figure skater did that? Yeah, most likely they fell on their face, right? But you get used to that rotation. You get used to that repetitive motion as well. So the ampullary cupula is what we're talking about. That's what's being affected during rotational movement. And you can see that in your textbook on page 582. No, these are neurons. These guys, no, these are neurons. These are columnar epithelial cells. But these are not epithelial, they're neurons.
The stereocilia are neurons.
They're basically dendrites of the neuron.
Okay.
They kind of have the same name, but they're not.
Just because it looks...
It's long finger-like extensions, exactly. Yeah, and it's too bad they didn't make it a different color so you could see the contrast, but they're not epithelial cells, they're neurons. What kind of neuron? Somebody said it. Sensory receptors, sensory neurons. So they send information where? Yeah, they send information to the brain for processing. So this is a diagram that shows us some of the, do you have this in your book? Yeah. On page 581, we see what happens as we move our head in different directions and some of the information that gets processed in the cerebral cortex. who's going to help with balance besides these guys? There's other information that you're going to process for your sense of balance. And you kind of touched a little bit on that when I was talking about the spinning lady. Yeah, your sense of vision, too. Have you ever walked, and one of the things, I can remember this so clearly, I don't know why. When I was little, we had a fire drill. And I happened to be in the room that we were going to go out the fire escape. And it totally freaked me out because I couldn't seem to see the next step. So I felt like I was off balance because visually, the cues I was getting were messing up the processing in my brain with respect to where I had to go next. So I was nervous about putting my foot down, and I felt unbalanced because of the visual cues I got with respect to balance. So you get visual cues along with the cues from that inner ear that are going to help you with balance. Okay? And so that spinning person, sometimes one of the things they say is try to key in on one little point instead of seeing all of the points. One of the problems with people that get car sick, people that don't get car sick drive down the road and they see trees, cars, we're good. People that get car sick see tree, 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 cars, 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 cars. And all of that stimulation affects other organ systems in your body, like your stomach. So you process things differently. You sort of get those cues a little bit differently, and you can see the effect. So that's my region where I'm going to find all of those wonderful little receptors. And again, different direction is going to help with different bits of information for processing with respect to equilibrium. So, input. Information about the body's position in space comes from three main sources. Those receptors that we're going to find in the inner ear, your visual cues. What else? When I do this, how do I know to get down in this position? Yeah, when my muscles contract, we're also going to get information from those tendon sheaths that we talked about last semester. So somatic receptors from skin, from muscle, from joints. When I pressure against my hands, for example, those receptors are going to say I need to push. So those are part of the processing as well. Cerebellum was my coordination hub that we talked about last semester when we talked about the brain. And the cerebellum is going to help channel those messages to where they need to go. The vestibular nuclei in the brain stem is going to act like that railroad switch to tell everybody where to go and what to do. And we're going to see some of the different cranial nerves responsible for movements of eyes and movements of neck. We're done with chapter 15. I want to do I didn't plug in. What did I do? Oh yeah, no, I plugged in the clicker box. I'm very confused. Got a clicker? Want to do a couple questions? Don't worry about it, I'm not going to count them. So of the following senses, which accounts for the majority of sensory receptors in the body? So at this point, if you had a clicker, you would pick your answer, click it in, and then I can see up in the corner how many people have clicked in. And that tells me about how many people are in the class. From now on, that's how I take attendance. Now I have a sheet coming around. Everybody sign the sheet? Your clickers are going to, correct. See, that's where I was a slacker this week, because I have to physically put your names into this program. You clicking in today, your numbers will be registered in this class. But now I have to go link them to your name. When you register your clicker online, you're going to put in that code. And that's what I see in this program. It's neat.
And you can also tell them we don't know.
Yep. I used to make it part of the class. I don't now, because that kind of put too much pressure on everybody. But that's how I'm going to take attendance. So I'll give you to the end of this week, and then you have to have your clicker. And if you forget it at home, tough. Yes? So make sure you leave it in your car or leave it someplace where you're going to remember to bring it to class.
You don't have to register a student.
Nope. So we only have 31 people here? 31 with clickers. All right, what's the answer? Oh, it don't. Okay. Majority says, yep. C. Okay? So I guess I don't have them set up with the answers. I got to go fix that. Questions? Yeah, no. We're going to go do our hormones. We'll do more clicker after we finish endocrine. So is there any questions? Notice I haven't changed that's the old textbook too, by the way. Yeah, no, the new textbook is the soccer girl. I have to fix that. Yep. Oh, let's do that. Good point. Let's do that before we go into hormones. So go online, get into CM Connect. Of course, my computer is amazingly fast today. And it's on our main website. How do we get there? cmcc.edu, and CM Connect is right here. If you've never logged into CM Connect, follow the directions on the front page, and then you can go in and change your login information to make it be something you can remember. And mine changes all the time, so I hate that. We have to have capital letters and symbols and all that other nonsense. I don't have enough compartments in my brain for all of that information. So then you have to go find your course, which is another chore for me, because normally you'd go under My Courses, yes? So you click on my, see all the courses I teach? Yeah, no. I'm the department chair, so I have access to everybody's course in my whole department. Which is a pain when I have to go find my course because it comes up in this giant list. And under My Courses, for me, they're no longer in order. It's like, thank you for complicating my life even more. So I have to kind of go in there a little bit differently than you. But normally you would go under My Courses, and you would find the course and click on it. And this is what you'd find there. So for you to go take your quiz, what are you going to do? You're going to go here to coursework. Now it's going to look different for me than it does for you. And then you're going to find the assignment. There it is. And see how it says online quiz beside it? So the date is there. Thursday, 1/24 at 9:20. It's due by then. You go in and you open it up. And I'm going to get all your names here. But it shows that it's open and that you're ready to go. For you, when you go in and click on it, you're going to see a place where it says, do you want to start? Be ready to start and finish. If you have to pee, pee before the quiz. I don't want to get the call, I had to go to the bathroom in a few minutes. And yeah, no. Be ready to, like you're going to come to class and take a quiz, be ready to take it and finish it. You have 15 minutes to do it, okay? So that's how you're going to get there. Do what it tells you to do. When you're finished, click the finished and all of that good stuff. So we'll see how it goes. Questions?
Why do all of mine say open?
All yours say open because I have no idea. All your quizzes? Oh, because no grade has been put in or anything like that, so everything is all just open. There's no quizzes up there. If you see, the only place you see online quiz, it's chapter 15.
Does it tell us our grade immediately after we take it?
Yep. So that's good, because a lot of you were always, what did I get on the quiz? What did I get on the quiz? So yeah, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for us all. Hopefully it'll work well, and we'll like it. Okay, the next chapter, endocrine system. We're going to talk about what? Hormones. And we're going to talk about the different organs that create those hormones. And we're going to talk about the hormones and how they affect cells and cellular activities. So another way to control the body and what it's doing is to produce hormones or chemicals to change what cells do for a living. What have we already talked about that can change cellular responses to the environment?
Our senses.
Our senses, which are part of what system? The nervous system, right? So we can get a nervous response from a group of neurons, for example, that are going to change what cells do, for example, in our muscles. So if I want muscles to contract, and when muscles contract, what happens? We'll do a quick refresher. Neuron response changes chemical inside, charge. Yeah, sodium rushes in. Neurotransmitter comes in contact with receptors on the muscle. Sodium rushes in, changes the charge, messes up the little calcium pumps on the terminal cisternae. Calcium is released into the area where we find the bleh, or the thin and thick fibers that are helped by regulatory proteins, troponin and tropomyosin. When calcium comes in contact with troponin, it causes a shape change and exposes the binding sites on the actin molecules for the myosin heads. You with me on this? So see how the nervous system can change what happens inside the cells. The endocrine system does it in a different way. So that chemical is released by some of the different organs that we're going to discuss in this system. And that chemical, a hormone, will come in contact with a receptor on a cell that has a receptor for that hormone. What do we call those cells that have receptors for the hormones that we might be talking about? These guys are called target cells. Not all cells are affected by all hormones. Did you know that? In order for me to be affected by a hormone, I have to have a receptor for that hormone. Yes? So when we talk about the endocrine system, we talk about cellular regulation. Cellular regulation in many different systems in the body. They give us a list on page 592. Things like the reproductive system, your growth and development, maintaining balance within the body, electrolyte balance, fluid balance, regulate how fast things happen in cells or how slow things happen in cells. So regulate cellular metabolism. And then body's defense system is going to help mobilize itself with some of the chemicals we produce in the endocrine system. So all of these things are going to help regulate body functions to help maintain homeostasis. Everybody knows what that means, right? Balance in the body. So, we're going to talk about two different types of glands made of epithelial tissue that produce these chemicals. Exocrine glands and endocrine glands. What's the difference between the two? You should know that by now. No. Endocrine is going to secrete their product where? Into the blood. And the blood is then going to transport that product through the body. An exocrine gland is going to transport its product through what? Some sort of tube or duct. Yes? We just talked about some exocrine glands in the previous chapter. Give me an example. Ceruminous glands? Kind of, yeah. Who else? Lacrimal glands, your tears, right? Those are exocrine glands. So, the chemicals themselves, the hormones that we're going to talk about in this chapter, that are produced by all of these different portions of the endocrine system, are where the business end is going to happen. Some of those chemicals will affect the cells that produce them. We call those autocrines. And some of those chemicals will affect cells beside them, paracrines. Some of them are amino acid based. Some of them are steroid based. So in this chapter, one of the things you need to understand is the different mechanism of action between a steroid-based hormone or lipid-soluble hormone and an amino acid-based hormone or a water-soluble hormone. They work different. So we're going to talk about that mechanism of action between the two different types of hormones. So we're also in this chapter, and this is kind of like a vocabulary chapter for you, because we're going to lay down the base for you in this chapter, and then through the rest of the semester we're going to talk about all of these guys more specifically when we hit that system. So in this chapter, what I want you to do, I don't know if you've ever done this to study before, make yourself take a little piece of paper and fold it, make yourself some columns. The gland that makes this hormone, you should know. So we're going to talk about a bunch of them in this chapter. There's some up in the brain, the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the thymus, the pancreas, the adrenals. Reproductive organs also create hormones as well. Know the hormones that all of these guys make. And then know what that hormone affects. Okay? And that's what we're going to get. That's the basis of this chapter. Besides the fact that we have to understand the mechanism of action of the hormones themselves. So you with me? Okay, good. We talked about second messenger systems, didn't we? Just the last chapter, we talked about G proteins and second messenger systems. So in your textbook, they are going to outline the chemistry of hormones on page 593, 594, 595. And they're going to talk about the difference between lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones. Two ways hormones can affect what the cell does for a living. This particular diagram is showing us something called the second messenger system, and these hormones are affecting the cell without ever getting into the cell. Because through the second messenger system, and these are water-soluble hormones, the hormone itself is that cute little ball on the end, is carried through blood plasma across cells. And they come in contact with receptors on cells. And what do we call the cells that had receptors for that hormone? The target cell. Those hormones are the first messenger just like we talked about in the last chapter. When they come in contact with the receptor for that hormone on the plasma membrane of a target cell, they are going to change shape. And once they change shape, they're going to kick who into motion? G proteins, with the help of a switch from GDP to GTP. Now, we learned a molecule with the D's and the P's last semester. And, you know, if you add something to it, it went from DP to TP. And if you took something off of it, it went from TP to DP. Is that ringing a bell? ATP, remember? When I added a phosphate to ADP, I turned it into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. G, guanine diphosphate, changes with the help of some energy phosphorylating it to GTP. And that's what's going to kind of give that little G protein a kick. So just like we talked about last chapter, that G protein is going to be on the move. The receptor activates the G protein. Now we call it an active GS. When it comes in contact with an enzyme, in this case it's called adenylate cyclase, we're going to see a different reaction happening to create who? Well, adenylate cyclase converts ATP to CAMP, cyclic AMP, good enough for me, and that's my second messenger. The presence of the second messenger is going to cause some changes within the cell, and it's going to activate proteins that are normally sitting inactive. That's going to change what the cell does for a living. So it might speed something up. It might slow something down. It might cause that cell to release something. I'll give you an example. Who ate breakfast this morning? Very good. Who didn't eat breakfast this morning? You're dead. Are you dead? No. Hormones like insulin, for example, will help regulate what the cells do for a living. In this case, when you ate your breakfast this morning, you hopefully took in some sort of carbohydrate material. And insulin is going to help you get that carbohydrate material into your cells to do what with it? Turn it into energy. Put it through another wonderful, exciting bit of information we're going to learn this semester called cellular respiration. It causes your cells to speed up metabolism by bringing that in. These activated proteins will help it do that. Now, what if you didn't eat breakfast this morning? But maybe you might have some in storage. Glucagon, another hormone, can affect a different group of cells to break down some stored glucose that you might have in your liver and maybe some in your muscles and release it into the circulatory system so I can bring it into the cells for cellular respiration. So hormones are going to affect what the cell does for a living. It might also cause things to be released from the cells. Same hormones that we just talked about, insulin and glucagon, who makes them? Yeah, the pancreas that we'll learn in this chapter, the endocrine system. But it's going to affect all cells in my body. Well, how does it get there? So those cells will release those hormones into the circulatory system with the signal of other hormones and the nervous system so that they can then affect behavior of cells down the line. So second messenger systems are going to help change what the cell does for a living, and water-soluble hormones go through this mechanism of action for us to change what that cell does. Some of the different hormones activated by this particular second messenger, there's other ones, are these guys. Epinephrine ACTH, FSH, LH, glucagon, parathyroid hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and calcitonin. You're going to know them all by name in just a moment. There's other second messenger systems. There's one called the IP3 second messenger system. So in your textbook, on page 594, they talk about the cyclic AMP signaling mechanism. Then they talk about something called the PIP2 calcium signaling mechanism. I don't think they go through IP3. Don't worry about IP3. Basically, I want you to know the mechanism of action of the cyclic AMP signaling mechanism. Again, we see a numbered list of things, and Maria enjoys asking you essay questions that have order like that. So that might be a possible essay question on your next exam. Remember, hormones don't necessarily have to speed things up. They can also do what? Slow things down. Just like the nervous system can speed things up and slow things down, so can hormones and their mechanism of action. So they can upregulate or downregulate activities within the cell. And that's what they talk about under target cell specificity in your textbook. The other type of hormone and its mechanism of action is the lipid-soluble hormone. That works very differently than the water-soluble hormone. It doesn't work on a second messenger system. What is your plasma membrane made of? Be scientific with me. It's lipids, but what kind of lipids? It's a phospholipid bilayer. Remember that? So lipids can pass through lipids fairly easily. It's hard, though, for lipids to go through a fluid medium, isn't it? Because lipids are what? They're fat, but chemical reactivity. They're not water soluble. What's that word? Give me the fancy word for it. Hydrophobic. So in order for them to travel through the circulatory system, they need help. They need a protein carrier of some kind. Same thing's going to happen once they get to the cell. So in this diagram, we see a steroid hormone, a lipid-based hormone, that can get in, must have some sort of receptor on the surface, some sort of door to let it in on the surface of the cell. Once it gets in, inside the cell, it needs a chaperone to carry it to where it needs to go. And in the case of these hormones, they're going to do their job directly in the nucleus. So they are going to link up with a receptor protein to form a receptor hormone complex, which is then going to be transported into this big purple thing. What's the big purple thing? The nucleus. What's inside the nucleus? DNA, RNA. And what do they do for a living? Somebody said it. They help direct the synthesis of proteins. If I can directly affect the synthesis of proteins, I can change what proteins are created and what the cell does for a living. So lipid-soluble hormones are going to act in the nucleus to directly affect the proteins that are created through transcription and translation in the DNA. Remember that crap from last semester? You gotta know that. Remember transcription and translation? DNA unzipped, what happened? I created a copy of that information with messenger RNA. Then what happened? Messenger RNA left the nucleus and went and parked itself on a group of other RNA that was going to help me translate the information, those ribosomes. And then with the help of another RNA molecule, tRNA, I was going to make myself a nice big chain of amino acids to create proteins. So lipid-soluble hormones act inside the cell and directly affect proteins that are going to be created through transcription and translation. See the difference? Water-soluble hormones never even get inside the cell. They kick off a chain of events through a second messenger system that will then affect proteins inside the cell. Lipids get into the cell and affect it at the direct source. See the difference between the two? I hope so. All right, so that was the scary part, believe it or not. The rest of the part, basically, it's memorization. So, there's 3 different ways that I can stimulate hormone release. Other hormones can stimulate hormone release. Remember on that last diagram we saw one that's called FSH and TSH. Those hormones created in the brain can actually stimulate other endocrine glands to secrete their hormones. FSH is follicle-stimulating hormone. It can stimulate reproductive organs to do something different. TSH is thyroid-stimulating hormone. It can stimulate the thyroid to release its hormones. So when we talk about hormone release, other hormones can cause that to happen. The nervous system can cause it to happen as well. So the nervous system can directly stimulate endocrine glands to secrete hormones. And then your bodily fluids can carry hormones to stimulate cells to do something different. So what's the fancy name for those 3 ways? Hormone stimulation. So hormones, in this case, from the brain, a gland we're going to talk about in the brain called the pituitary gland, when it's released into blood, can actually stimulate other endocrine glands to secrete their hormones. Or we might have nervous system. That one's pretty self-explanatory. So the neurons in this preganglionic sympathetic fiber can stimulate an endocrine gland, the medulla of the adrenal gland, to secrete its hormones. Or something in the blood is going to triggerate. That's a word I just invented, triggering. I like it. Yeah, trigger hormone release. Like you guys who didn't eat your breakfast this morning, for example. You guys who didn't eat your breakfast this morning, what happened to your blood glucose levels? So somebody's monitoring blood glucose levels. Who might that be? Your brain! And very pissed off at you that you didn't eat breakfast this morning, I will add. Because what kind of energy molecule does your brain like to use to make its ATP? Glucose. So it's going to tell your pancreas, hey, this clown didn't eat breakfast again. Do you think you could secrete some glucagon so we can get some glucose into the circulatory system? Or, in the example here, blood calcium levels are doing what? Going down. In order for me to maintain things like nervous system control or muscle contractions, I have to have enough blood calcium to do that. So I'm going to stimulate what? Nervous system will say, hey, not enough calcium. Where do you think I'm going to get my calcium from? Where do I store it? We learned this last semester. Bone is a good place to store it. Now, if I got to get it out, What do I have to do? I got to break it down. Who's going to help me break it down? Osteoclasts. Osteoclasts used to be monocytes just hanging out in the circulatory system waiting for something to do. Well, when that hormone secreted by that endocrine gland, parathyroid hormone secreted by parathyroid gland, gets into the circulatory system and comes in contact with its target, monocytes, what's going to happen to them? They're going to start doing something different for a living, right? They're going to morph into who? Osteoclasts. And then they're going to go and help break down what? Bone matrix, so I can do what? Release that calcium into the circulatory system and bring it up. So that's called humoral. Humors is another name for the fluids that float around in your body. Blood plasma, for example. So 3 different ways to stimulate hormone release. Hormones can stimulate hormones, the nervous system, or some sort of imbalance in your humors. Humoral stimulus. Yes? You with me? Good. Hormones don't last forever. So they talk a little bit about half-life, onset, duration. There's different enzymes in our bodies that actually work to break them down. So they don't last forever and ever. So they also talk about interaction of hormones on the target. Remember, hormones can slow things down, hormones can speed things up, or they can help work together to create what we call a synergistic relationship with other cells. So, permissive, synergism, or antagonism is also described in your textbook on page 598. All right. Time for the vocabulary list. Time for that piece of paper. Let's go through all of the different endocrine glands, talk a little bit about the hormones that it produces, and what those hormones affect. The nice thing about your textbook is the creation of the table. And one of the reasons I chose this textbook to use in this class, because I like things when we make them small. Do you like when we make them small? I'd rather see something in this much space than in 4 pages. So, as I go through this, all these glands, there's going to be a special table for each of them. On page 602 and 603 is the table for this particular gland. And this is called the pituitary gland. Now there's 2 parts to the pituitary gland. There's a front part, there's a back part. We don't say front part and back part in science, do we?
Posterior.
Anterior and posterior. Now the anterior pituitary gland is sometimes referred to as the master endocrine gland because it secretes a whole bunch of hormones that are going to control many of the other endocrine glands. It actually has cells that produce these hormones and release them into the circulatory system to have an effect on other endocrine tissue and endocrine glands. The posterior releases stuff into the blood as well, but it doesn't make its own hormones. It's only a storage place for hormones. So the posterior pituitary gland, which we're talking about here in this diagram, is actually just a storage place. It will release its stored material when need be, but it doesn't make its own hormones. Who makes the hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary gland? Yeah, the hypothalamus. So neurons in the hypothalamus, one of the jobs it has, the hypothalamus is a very, very busy portion of the midbrain. But one of the things it does for a living is make certain hormones. And those hormones are then travel down those axons and are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Things like oxytocin. What's that for, you know? Uterine contractions. Another one, ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. Anybody know what that's for? What's a diuretic? Makes you pee a lot. What do you think anti-diuretic hormone? Makes you not pee a lot, yes? That hormone, ADH, is going to help you conserve water. Where do you think it's going to have its effect? Who's going to help control water balance in the body? The kidneys, right? The kidneys are just like little filters. They suck all the fluid out, and then they put back into the circulatory system what they shouldn't have sucked out. Under the control of what? Hormones, chemicals, ions in the body. When we talk about the renal system, we're going to talk about a bunch of these guys. And ADH is going to come up again. So ADH is going to help me conserve water, so I don't pass a lot of water through the filtering in the kidneys, in the urine. When would ADH come into play? When I'm thirsty, right? That's how I know I'm secreting more of this, to hold on to water. When I'm thirsty or I'm hot or I have a lot of physical activity going on, what else is going on with respect to water? You're losing a lot. Do you think I want to filter a lot of that out in the kidneys if I'm losing a lot? No. So that's going to help with water regulation. So, again, posterior pituitary gland. Another name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. And the posterior pituitary gland doesn't make its own hormones, it stores hormones. It's connected to that midbrain region by a little area called the infundibulum. And what we find there is a bunch of those axons, at least in the posterior region anyway, of neurons from the hypothalamus. So when I ask you who makes antidiuretic hormone, what are you going to say? Hypothalamus, not the posterior pituitary gland. If I ask you where is antidiuretic hormone secreted from, you're going to say posterior pituitary. See the difference? Alrighty, so that's the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, a little bit more busy. So the posterior secretes neurohormones from the hypothalamus. The anterior, or adenohypophysis, is actually making its own hormones. Notice all the blood vessels that surround both anterior and posterior pituitary gland. Why do you think it's so rich in blood vessels? Yeah, remember, I have to get these hormones into the circulatory system so they can affect other endocrine glands throughout the body. So the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary gland, actually makes its own hormones. And again, where are we going to find what hormones they make? Go over on page 602 and 603. So the list is a little bit longer. We see things like GH, growth hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and another one called prolactin. All of the effects of these hormones are listed in these charts for you. So growth hormone is going to trigger increased metabolism for growth in things like the liver, in muscles, in bones. If I have a problem with growth hormone, what might happen to me? You might be too tall if there's an over secretion, or too short. So giantism, when I have a a big increase in this particular hormone for some reason, or dwarfism if I have a big decrease in this hormone. We should also know a little bit about too much or too little, and that's also in these tables as well. Thyroid stimulating hormone, what's that going to do? Stimulate the thyroid, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And thyroid and the hormones that the thyroid produce have a lot to do with cellular metabolism, the rate at which reactions take place. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Who's that going to stimulate? The adrenal glands. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about the different hormones released by the adrenals. The adrenals sit on top of your kidneys. Luteinizing hormone. Nope. Has nothing to do with the eyes, testes, ovaries. It's going to help with the production of reproductive cells. And prolactin is one that's going to help stimulate milk production. So, know all the different hormones. Know the guy who makes them. They're all listed in your book. Prolactin, PRL. Which one? Follicle stimulating. And again, in your textbook, you'll find these, all the hormones produced by the pituitary, both anterior and posterior, 602 and 603. That's the table. It looks like this. Yes? I love the tables. Rely on the tables a lot for this chapter. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, who makes that? The hypothalamus. Where is it stored? Posterior pituitary gland. So this is one of those little charts that shows us some of the effects of hormones. So anterior, posterior pituitary gland, we see it up there. Growth hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland. It affects liver, other tissues, causes insulin-like growth factors to be released. What did insulin do for a living? We're going to talk about it specifically in a minute. Yeah, it regulates blood sugar by doing what? It brings it down by doing what? What does insulin do? Do you know? When it comes in contact with receptors on your cells, it opens up a gate that allows more glucose to come into your cells at a faster rate. If I can bring glucose in at a faster rate, normally it would come in very, very slowly. If I can bring it in at a faster rate, I can speed up the energy production, right? I can speed up the reaction of cellular respiration because I have more juice. So that's what insulin does. And it affects growth by allowing these cells to make more energy so they can grow at a faster rate. Remember, hormones can have direct actions like that, but they can also have indirect actions. And they can cause other things to happen within the body. So growth hormone can also help to decrease fat by causing you to burn more fat, use more fat for energy. And it can also affect carbohydrate metabolism by increasing blood glucose and other anti-insulin effects. Because insulin would do what to glucose levels? Bring it down. This can also help to counteract it as well. Brings it down in the plasma, increases it in the cells. But when I measure blood glucose, or your nervous system measures blood glucose, how does it measure it? In your plasma. Okay? So, stimulus, response, result. That's what you kind of need to know about all of these different hormones. All right, some imbalances they talk about on page 604, 605, giantism, dwarfism, acromegaly. What's acromegaly? Really big bones. Exactly. So it affects the epiphyseal plate and growth at the epiphyseal plate. Remember we talked about that when we talked about bones? Okay. And that's going to affect bones in length, and it can also, in this case, affect the width of a bone as well. I don't know. Did he? Abraham Lincoln? I don't know. He was a tall guy. I remember that. So those are some of the imbalances that we see. And again, your book does a very good job of giving you that table and then talking about all these specific hormones throughout the text. So on Thursday, thank you, my brain just went dead, we are going to pick up with the thyroid and the making of thyroid hormones. Don't forget to take your quiz. Take your quiz, the whole quiz, and nothing but the quiz once you start. You'll find it under coursework. See you on Thursday.